While the Romans were busy consolidating land acquired in the First Samnite War, a young Macedonian general crowned himself king after his father, Philip II, was assassinated. This was of course Alexander III, more commonly known as Alexander the Great. The Greeks paid no heed to the west and the wars of Italian tribes, as they were more focused on the east and the vast Persian Empire. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with 40,000 men and 6,000 cavalry. Until his death only 11 years later, Alexander and his phalanx would go on to conquer all of Persia and parts of northern India. At the time of his death, Alexander commanded the largest empire in the known world. His death marks the end of classical Greece and the start of the Hellenistic period. Having no designated successor, his generals broke into fighting for control of the crumbling empire. These generals were known as Diadochi, and they would go on to lead powerful kingdoms in Greece, Asia Minor, the Levant, and Egypt. In these turbulent times, a second cousin of Alexander the Great, Pyrrhus of Epirus, was born. When Pyrrhus was only 2, his father lost control of the army while campaigning in Macedonia, and he was dethroned. Illyrian king Glaucias gave refuge to the young prince and his family. When he was 11, Glaucias invaded Epirus and installed Pyrrhus as puppet king. But this was short-lived, as he was deposed in 302 BCE and driven into his second exile. During his exile, he served in the wars of the Diadochi, and he eventually ended up in Egypt as a prisoner of Ptolemy I. Ptolemy, who was always looking to expand his short list of allies, married Pyrrhus off to his stepdaughter. He then gave him an army and sent him off to Epirus, where he won back his old kingdom. Pyrrhus' second reign started in 297 BC, and he was the next 10 odd years to consolidate his power. By that time, the wars of the Diadochi were mostly over, and the Hellenic world was finally at peace, with borders more or less settled. This meant that the young and ambitious general had no easy targets in the east, so he turned to the west and the rich cities of Magna Graecia. It was then that he received a call for aid from Tarentum. Securing help from Ptolemy II in the form of soldiers and war elephants, he boarded his ships and sailed off to Italy. Although the cities of Magna Graecia shared a common history and culture, they were not united. Instead, they were separate city-states acting in their own selfish interests. The Romans knew this and decided to play cities off one another, using a well-known tactic: divide and conquer. The city of Thurii played right into their hand by asking for help against the Lucanians in 285 BC, and Rome happily obliged. While this was going on, the hostilities in the north were restarted when the Celts besieged Arretium, a Roman military outpost in Etruria. The force that was sent to deal with them was destroyed, and some Etruscan cities joined the Gallic invasion. The Samnites, still bitter about their subjugation, saw that the Romans were once again engaged on two fronts, and they decided to rise up in rebellion. The rebellion lasted for 10 years and could easily be described as the Fourth Samnite War. But considering most of the major battles were fought under the leadership of Pyrrhus, the rebellion is considered part of the Pyrrhic War. In 283 BC, the Romans won a decisive victory against the Gauls and Etruscans in the Second Battle of Lake Vadimo. With this victory, they secured peace in the north and were free to focus on the Greeks in the south. This meant that when Thurii again requested help in 282 BCE, Gaius Fabricius Luscin was sent to deal with the Lucanians. After he successfully lifted the siege and scattered the invaders, he went on a sightseeing boat tour in the Gulf of Taranto. According to some old treaty, the Romans were forbidden to enter the Gulf, which was under Tarentine rule. Luck would have it that the Tarentines were in the midst of festivities honoring the god of wine Dionysius. When the news of Roman ships entering the Gulf reached the inebriated crowd, they rose up in anger and attacked the intruders. The consul was killed in the scuffle, and out of the 10 ships, 4 were sunk and 2 captured. The Tarentines didn't stop there. They assembled an army and marched onto Thurii. The city was taken easily, and the Roman garrison was expelled. Instead of bearing the full force of the Republic onto the Greeks, the Senate chose a more measured approach. They sent envoys to demand reprisal from the Tarentines. The delegation was met with insults and laughter from the citizen assembly. The story goes that the local drunkard then discharged his bowels onto a Roman toga. To this, Postumius, leader of the delegation, proclaimed, "This toga will be washed clean, with much blood." Postumius didn't clean his toga. Instead, he displayed it in the Senate. Although the legions were stretched thin at the moment, the Romans had no other choice but to declare war. A Roman army swiftly reached Tarentum and ravaged the countryside. The Tarentines were offered the same terms Postumius presented, but no one in the assembly was laughing now. Although the citizens were evenly split on what to do next, it was agreed that they would reject the terms and request aid from Epirus. Envoys were sent to King Pyrrhus of Epirus and assured him that a great coalition of Greeks, Lucanians and Samnites was waiting for him in Italy. They of course largely inflated the number of troops at their disposal, but this was enough to convince Pyrrhus to cross the Ionian Sea and deal with these barbarians. While Pyrrhus was amassing his forces, he sent an expeditionary army into Italy. They arrived in a nick of time, as Tarentum had already fallen and the aristocracy was preparing to give the city over to the Romans. The Greeks quickly dealt with the legions and took control of the city. When the city was finally secured and all the necessary preparations made, the Tarentines sent a fleet to carry the rest of the army. Pyrrhus had amassed a force of 22,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry, and 20 war elephants. The crossing was done in the middle of winter, and the harsh winds from the north blew the fleet off course. Many ships were badly damaged, but the bulk of the army reached Italy in 280 BCE. Incredibly, all 20 war elephants survived the crossing. Although the Tarentines welcomed Pyrrhus as a liberator, he acted more as a tyrant and a conqueror. He took control of the city and shut down all public gatherings. The men were forcibly conscripted into the army. Some Tarentines, so accustomed to their freedoms, left their homes and went into exile. The news of Pyrrhus's arrival caused panic in Rome. They were exhausted by the long years of fighting the Samnites, and the army reserves were running low. This meant that the Romans had to levy fresh troops. It's reported that even the landless citizens, who were usually exempt from military service, were called upon. Consul Publius Valerius Laevinus marched south with 8 legions or about 30,000 men. Pyrrhus was a great general, but he wasn't a warmonger. He offered immediate peace between the Romans and the Italian Greeks, but this was soundly rejected. They left him no other choice but to take the field. The armies met near the Greek town of Heraclea. Pyrrhus watched in awe as the Romans meticulously constructed their camp. This was far from the barbarian rebel he was promised. He was impressed by their discipline and attention to detail. At this moment he began to doubt an easy victory, and he wanted to wait for reinforcements. But the consul had the numerical advantage and was eager for a fight. The Greeks were defending the river crossing, but the Roman cavalry crossed the river downstream and surprised the defenders who had to retreat. When the legions finally crossed the river, the Battle of Heraclea started. The Romans numbered close to 40,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry, while Pyrrhus commanded a force of 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 20 war elephants. Pyrrhus used tactics perfected by Alexander the Great. The bulk of his force was a Macedonian-style phalanx that advanced through the middle. The flanks were supported by the cavalry. The elephants were kept as a reserve. The Romans used a conventional 3-line maniple system with cavalry on the flanks. This would be the first time that the Roman maniples faced off against a well-trained and disciplined Greek phalanx. The Romans had trouble reaching the Greeks with their short sword, but they stood their ground and the battle turned into a stalemate. Pyrrhus rode on the flank, but he was unable to break the Roman cavalry and he had to pull back. He then decided to send in his elephants. This was too much for the Romans, who had never before seen such terrible beasts, let alone face them on the field. The horses were the first to panic and they ran for the camp. The elephants charged into the Roman lines and trampled a great many men. Archers on their backs rained arrows down on the Romans. Seeing the day was lost, the consul ordered a full retreat. This wasn't a headless flight, but rather an orderly retreat back to the well-defended camp. This ensured that the Roman losses stayed at the minimum. Romans lost 7,000 men with thousands more captured, while Pyrrhus lost around 4,000. Plutarch also writes that Pyrrhus lost some of his best troops and trusted generals. Considering these numbers, this battle could be characterized as the first of the famous Pyrrhic victories. As we have seen before, the Romans could easily replenish their forces with fresh recruits, but the young king would struggle to replace the core of his army. Following this battle, a number of Italian tribes, including the Samnites, declared openly for Pyrrhus. He gathered his forces and marched north towards Rome in hopes of winning over more allies. But the cities of Campania were not impressed and they refused to negotiate with him, staying loyal to Rome. The consul was then reinforced with 2 more legions from Rome and he was in hot pursuit of the Greeks. At the same time, the army from Etruria started moving south. Pyrrhus advanced to within a few miles of Rome, but he didn't pose a significant threat to the well-defended city, so he turned back towards Samnium. He didn't achieve anything noteworthy with his little excursion, but only put himself in a dangerous position. In the winter of 279 BCE, the Romans opened negotiations with Pyrrhus. A delegation arrived from Rome to negotiate the release of Roman prisoners. Pyrrhus was surprised by this, as he was expecting the Romans to surrender. He released the prisoners and showered the delegation with gifts, but the delegates refused the gifts, claiming they already had enough possessions. Nevertheless, Pyrrhus was not dismayed, and he sent his personal advisor Cineas to Rome. Our ancient sources claim that Cineas was the most eloquent public speaker of his time. He arrived in Rome with large amounts of gold. Rather than meeting with the Senate immediately, he spent a couple of days mingling with the Roman elites and distributing his gold. When he finally addressed the Senate, Cineas already had support from a large number of senators. The terms he presented were frankly ludicrous. The Romans would have to abandon all their past conquests and confine themselves to Latium. Alliance with Pyrrhus was also offered. We are led to believe that the Senate was about to accept this proposal were it not for one man. Appius Claudius Caecus, of the Appian Way, by now old and blind, gave a famous speech to the Senate. Unfortunately, this speech was lost to history, but it was inscribed and read by famous Roman orators, including Cicero, who even praised it in some of his writings. It was so powerful indeed that the Senate unanimously voted to reject the proposal from Pyrrhus and resume hostilities. In the spring of 297 BCE, the armies were back on the field and they met near Asculum. A rumor began to spread in the Greek camp. The Roman army was commanded by Publius Decius Mus, son and grandson of the famous consuls with the same name who devoted themselves in battles and brought victory to the Romans. It was said that Decius was planning to do the same and secure another victory. Pyrrhus had to shut down this rumor and ordered his men to capture alive anyone wearing a ceremonial toga. The Battle of Asculum was a messy affair, as it appears that the battle lasted for 2 days. On the first day, Pyrrhus was positioned on uneven terrain and neither the phalanx nor the cavalry could be used effectively. Nightfall brought an end to the indecisive fighting. On the next day, Pyrrhus occupied a better position on the battlefield. His phalanx was placed in the middle, while the cavalry defended the flanks. The elephants were once again placed in reserve. The battle played out similarly to the previous Battle of Heraclea. The difference this time is that the Romans were prepared for the elephants. They had 300 chariots equipped with hooks, spikes and flaming arrows. They were specially designed to scare and immobilize the beasts, and they were somewhat successful. The fighting was heavy in the middle and both sides suffered heavy casualties. The elephants eventually overcame the chariots and aided the cavalry in breaking the Roman lines. Orderly retreat back to the camp once again ensured that the casualties stayed at the minimum. In the end, the Romans lost 6,000 men, while Pyrrhus lost 3,500. After the battle, Pyrrhus was commended for his victory, and he replied, "One more such victory, and we shall be utterly ruined." This gave rise to the famous phrase Pyrrhic victory, meaning a victory with a very high cost that is tantamount to defeat. Pyrrhus won 2 victories against the Romans, but he lost the core of his army and most of his friends and generals. He was now at a loss for what to do next. While planning his next move, a messenger arrived from Syracuse. Internal disputes had brought Syracuse down to its knees, and the Carthaginians were looking to conquer the whole of Sicily. The messengers asked Pyrrhus to take control of Syracuse and lead them in expelling the Carthaginians from the island. Rather than facing the legions again, Pyrrhus set sail for Sicily in the summer of 278 BCE. This was a very unpopular move. Firstly, the Italian Greeks were still in danger of expanding Roman influence. Secondly, the Carthaginians disliked this move even more, so they secured an alliance with Rome. This meant that Pyrrhus had to leave a large garrison in Italy. He crossed to Sicily with 8,000 men, some cavalry, and surviving elephants. He easily lifted the siege of Syracuse and went on a winning spree across Sicily. Pyrrhus successfully liberated every Greek city on the island and set siege to Lilybaeum, the only town under Carthaginian control. Carthage offered him peace, gold, and a number of ships to bear him back to Italy. Although he was keen to accept these terms, as the Roman armies were currently marching freely across southern Italy, the Sicilians and his council refused the offer. They were unwilling to negotiate as long as Carthage was present on the island. Lilybaeum was supplied by sea and could not be taken by siege. Pyrrhus decided to go all in and invade Carthage itself, but his Sicilian subjects refused to build him a fleet that would take him to Africa, and he was again at a loss for what to do next. The Romans were about to subjugate the southern tip of Italy and cut his land route to Tarentum. He had no other choice but to board his ships and return to Italy in the late summer of 276. While crossing the channel, he was attacked by the Carthaginians and he lost a large part of his fleet. Pyrrhus' short expedition into Sicily was a costly endeavor that didn't achieve anything in the end. The Romans were given enough time to regroup. The Samnites were badly beaten by the Romans and refused to ally with Pyrrhus when he returned, and the Greek cities grew resentful of this tyrant occupying their cities. On his way back to Tarentum, Pyrrhus tried to capture the strategically important city of Rhegium, but he was rebuffed with further losses to his dwindling army. Lacking rich friends and needing funds, he resorted to plundering Greek temples to pay his army. Even he had to acknowledge that this was an act of sacrilege. In the spring of 275 BC, Pyrrhus marched north with his force of 20,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry and the remaining elephants. He met the Roman army near the Samnite town Maleventum. Pyrrhus tried to perform a sneak attack in the night, but his forces got lost in the forest. In the morning, the Romans noticed that the army was out of position and attacked them. The Romans were ready for the elephants, and they used flaming arrows to scare the great beasts. Terrified elephants charged into the Greek lines and trampled a great deal of men. The rest of the army was easily defeated, and Pyrrhus was forced to flee. Pyrrhus finally suffered his first defeat on Italian soil. The city of Maleventum was renamed Beneventum, changing it from the city of bad events to the city of good events. Pyrrhus returned to Epirus with 8,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, less than half the force that crossed to Italy with him 6 years ago. He left a strong garrison in Tarentum, hoping to return soon and continue his campaign, but he would never again set foot in Italy. Having depleted his treasury, Pyrrhus was on the lookout for easy conquest. He raised a great army in Epirus and marched into Macedonia, deposed the king Antigonus II, and took his throne. Pyrrhus didn't learn anything in Italy, and instead of securing his throne, in 272 BCE he marched on Sparta in hopes of conquering the Peloponnese. Sparta was well defended and he was unable to take it, so instead he tried to take the city of Argos from Antigonus. While fighting in the streets of Argos, an old lady threw a tile from her window that struck Pyrrhus in the head and he was killed. With him died the hopes of Greek Italy. When Pyrrhus retreated from Italy, the Romans proceeded to destroy the remaining pockets of resistance in Samnium. Lucanians and other tribes in the south of Italy were then subjugated. The cities of Magna Graecia surrendered to Rome. The last free city in southern Italy was Tarentum, but when they heard the news of Pyrrhus' death, they also surrendered to Rome. With this, the conquest of southern Italy was finally complete. This marks the end of the Greek city-states, with one notable exception, Syracuse. Cities in mainland Greece were busy fighting each other and they left the doors wide open for Philip II to conquer them. Now again, the city-states of Magna Graecia didn't stand united and they were easy pickings for the Romans. From now on, the history of the ancient world will be written exclusively by empires. Pyrrhus claimed descent from mythical hero Achilles. He was also the second cousin of Alexander the Great. This meant that Pyrrhus saw himself as the next in line of the great Greek warriors. The rest of the Diadochi tried to embody Alexander with their words and demeanor, but Pyrrhus alone could match him with his actions. He was a capable general and he led his troops from the front. He would often charge with his cavalry into the thick of things, hoping to break the enemy line. And he was successful more often than not. It's no wonder that he is considered the most capable military leader of his generation. But every coin has two sides. His victories on the field were often followed by strategic blunders that would leave him in a far worse situation. After two major victories against the Romans, he was unable to push his advantage, so he sailed off to Sicily, leaving his Italian allies to fend for themselves. After conquering virtually all of Sicily, he overreached and had to flee, first to Italy and then all the way to Epirus. Even after he returned to Greece, he won the throne of Macedonia, but then quickly threw it all away by fighting an inconsequential war on the Peloponnese. Pyrrhus achieved nothing of note in the end. His most notable legacy is introducing the Romans to war elephants that would be used against them in the Punic Wars. However, his failed expedition did have one major consequence. The Hellenistic world finally realized that there was a new major player on the international stage. The Romans now controlled the whole of central and southern Italy. They were set on an inevitable course that would end in a clash with Carthage for ultimate supremacy over the Mediterranean. Join us next time as we set the stage for the First Punic War.